Hi everyone, I'm Leanne and today I'm going to be reviewing all of the books that I read in July. I have 12 books to talk to you about today and a real mix of different stuff. I have 7 books of adult fiction. One of those is a short story collection. One of those is a classic. I have 1 adult non-fiction to talk to you about, and then I have 4 books that were for young adults or even younger readers, and 2 of those are books that I read for work, so I'll leave those till the end. It was a bit of a mixed reading month in terms of quality of what I was reading. In some cases I mean the quality of the book, in some cases I mean the quality of the reading experience, and I think that's such an interesting thing when it comes to how we intersect with the books that we read. We bring so much of ourselves and our current circumstances to reading a book that can really alter what your reading experience is like, and therefore how you think about the quality of what you were reading. But I think one book that I read that definitely benefited from when and where and how I was reading it was Evenings and Weekends by Oisin McKenna. So this one has obviously been on my radar for a very long time. It is such a Leanne book. I'd had it recommended to me by so many people, and actually what prompted me to pick this one up when I did was a few different factors. I've had it on my shelves for quite a while and on my radar for even longer than that, since it came out, and I just hadn't got round to it yet, and it felt like one of those books that I knew that when I did come to it, it was gonna be right. But actually, I went to have my hair done and I was talking to my hairdresser about this book, and he hadn't read it yet, but he said that it had been recommended to him really, really highly. And it was one of those instances that you often have as a bookish person where you know quite a lot about a book that you haven't even read yet, because he was like, oh yeah, I was given this book, it was really recommended to me, I can't remember what it's called, it has a grey and orangey cover, you probably know what it is. And I was like, oh, it sounds like Evenings and Weekends by Oisin McKenna. And I proceeded to say loads of things about it, and he was like, oh, you've clearly read it then. And I was like, no. So that conversation spurred me on to finally pick it up. And also, this book is set over a couple of very hot days in London, and we have had many hot days in London recently. It started to become a little bit more overcast and dreary, but certainly at the beginning of August it was hot, and I decided to read this over a couple of days during that heat wave, and that was just the most perfect atmosphere to immerse myself in this story. And the summer that it's set over, I think, is the summer of 2019, which is the first summer that I lived in London. I remember that summer so vividly, so that felt really immersive to me. And I really love how London is almost a character within this book. I haven't even told you what it's about. It's about a group of friends. And initially when I started reading the book, I did have to take a bit of time for me to work out how all of these people knew each other and keep track of it, and who was related to who and who was friends with who and why and how they knew each other. There's also family members of the friends that are involved, and we're following all of these characters and just the nuances of their lives, their anxieties about their lives, comparing the expectation of what their lives would be like to what the reality of their lives are, their relationships with themselves and their loved ones, the various secrets that they have from one another. And I think through looking at these quite specific stories from these individual characters, there's a lot of stuff that is more broadly applicable to, I think, being a youngish person living in London. I thought everything about these characters was really acutely observed, and there's also a lot of things covered in relation to queer culture, but also those steps into a more mature adulthood. There's a lot to do with relationships with parents and not necessarily being able to recognize the fully fleshed out lives that your parents had before you came along. There is also this underlying device of a whale getting trapped in the Thames, and I feel I vaguely remember this happening, and I thought that was quite an interesting just little quirk to the story, and it does add a bit of reflection on how we get quite obsessed culturally with some events and then we forget about them quite quickly. The book's got a real social intelligence to it. It's got a really clever understanding of character and an understanding of place. I really, really liked this one, and I will read anything that Oisin McKenna writes now. I also read I Hope This Finds You Well by Natalie Sue. So this is a workplace contemporary novel. It's about Jolene, who doesn't really care about any of her co-workers or her job. She's not really interested in them. They are kind of just like a real like thorn in her side. She's also put on this like performance review because HR have discovered some of her misdemeanors in the workplace. And throughout the novel, we are following the strange relationship that develops between her and like the HR guy. But the real catalyst for the plot of this novel and how Jolene's perspective on her work and her colleagues shifts is when an IT screw up means that she has access to all of their emails and their like chats with their colleagues. So she finds herself gaining a lot of access to information, and some of that she can use as benefit to her. Some of it is not necessarily a benefit. You know, she can see the way her colleagues talk about her and talk about each other. Like, she's privy to a lot of information that she wouldn't otherwise have access to, and also like information about like her bosses. So she has this real kind of insider info on everything, but that also prompts her to see her colleagues as more fully rounded people. You know, she begins to see what their lives are like beyond the workplace interactions that she has with them. And I think this book is a really interesting analysis on like the roles that colleagues can play in your life and kind of what a weird relationship that can be. One of the additional aspects of Jolene's stories that I found quite interesting was her connection with her Iranian culture and how that makes people maybe view her slightly differently, but also how she views the world slightly differently to people around her. And I thought that insight to her culture was really great to see. There is a bit of a fake dating subplot to the book that I don't necessarily know why was there, but it did kind of add fruit, but it did kind of add like an element of like hijinks to the book. Overall, I thought this was a good read. I do think we are seeing more and more books now that are kind of analysing workplace culture, because I think kind of post-pandemic people have become a lot more kind of nuanced and critical about the role that that plays in our lives. So if that's something that interests you, I would recommend this one. I read The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This is one that I had initially really high expectations for because it sounded like Leanne catnip. I love a contemporary book that explores things like relationship with the self and romantic relationships, but with a bit of a speculative twist. But then I'd heard some mixed reviews about this book, so that altered my expectations for it, and this wasn't a new favourite. So this is about Lauren, who one night comes back to her house quite drunk, and there is this man in her house that claims to be her husband, and absolutely everything that she can see suggests that he is telling the truth, despite her having no idea who he is. So there are like pictures that prove it, like everyone else in her life knows about this guy, like she can find their old texts. And it turns out it is this strange like sci-fi situation where her attic is generating husbands for her. So the first guy that she ends up with as a husband, she can send back up to the attic and a new one will come down, and her life will be entirely altered based on this new husband. Like, all of the ripple effects of that different guy have done their rippling and impacted her life. And I think with a concept like that, you do have to have a level of suspending disbelief. Like, you do kind of need to accept that there probably will be some plot holes with that, because the concept is in many ways, I suppose, more of a thought experiment than something literal. But I think there were 3 reasons why I don't think the book really worked. Firstly, we have basically no introduction to Lauren as a character. Like, we are dropped in with her as she meets that first husband. And I really just felt like that was very jarring, and you needed to actually spend time with Lauren to have context of what her life was like before that, because I think connecting her with her as a character and understanding what her life was like before this all kicked off is really crucial, and we just didn't have that. Secondly, the frequency with which she changes husbands also makes it really difficult to connect with any of those male characters, even the ones that Lauren claims that she would like to keep or have like has a really good connection with. We spend such little time with them that we're not invested in that in the way that Lauren is. Some of the frequency with which she changes husbands is kind of for like humorous effect, but I actually think it's to the detriment of the novel. Like, when she ends up losing the husbands that she's like supposedly like really into and really invested in, it doesn't really have any emotional impact. And in fact, as we progress through the novel, nothing seems to have any emotional impact, not only on us as readers, but as Lauren as a character. She becomes like increasingly like reckless. And the third reason why I don't think this concept worked is because of the things that seem to be fixed in Lauren's timeline. So it seems like everything alters based on the new husband that she ends up with. Apart from this wedding that she's going to, and everything seems to be initially leading towards this wedding, why is this wedding such a fixed point in her timeline when it seems like so many other things change? And like, yes, I understand that like the wedding is between like two people who I guess under any circumstances ended up together, but it does seem like that there is a little like ripple effect on absolutely everything else, but not that wedding. I don't know, maybe I'm being overly critical of something that is just kind of meant to be a bit of fun, but I think because this should have been a book that I really love, I am disappointed. I have a couple of romance books. So I read The Kiss Countdown by Etta Easton. I have my gorgeous Afterlight edition from Illuma Crate. So this is the romance between Amory and Vincent. So Amory has recently lost her job as a really successful party planner, and she is now trying to make it on her own as like a small business. She's also about to be evicted from where she lives, and then she ends up running into her ex and his new girlfriend at like the worst possible time. She doesn't want to do that when she is feeling the way that she is feeling. So she ends up thrusting this guy called Vincent into this uncomfortable situation where she is using him as like a fake boyfriend to kind of save face in front of her ex. And that situation spirals into them having a full-blown like fake relationship. And as there often is with the fake dating trope, it is immediately obvious that they want to be together. And of course, they eventually will end up together. What I did think was quite unique and fun about this one was Vincent's job. So he is an astronaut, and we see how that not only impacts him potentially like blossoming a relationship with Marie, you know, those things like him being away for long periods of time, it being a very kind of labor intensive job, not only when you go on like expeditions into space, but also all of the training involved in that, how the job does kind of always need to come first, but also the impact that that has on Vincent's family, and particular his mother. Beyond that, I thought it was fun. I thought the chemistry between the two main characters was pitched really well. I also found Marie's career quite interesting, and like the relationship that she has with her family, especially her mother, who is like quite unwell, and the impact that that has on Marie, and this feeling that she has to kind of like stay strong for her family, and also like her rebuilding her career and becoming increasingly, I think, selective with the romances that I want to read. I think for a long time I kind of just accepted like romances, like they can just be like a palate cleanser, they can be just like this fun thing that I read and never think about again, and I do still believe that's true, but that doesn't mean I should read absolutely every romance that I can get my hands on. And I think if I continue to be more selective, this is one that I would be very happy to read whilst being more selective, which is a roundabout way of saying I think this is a very good romance. Another romance I read was Thank You for Sharing by Rachel Runya Katz. So this is the romance between Leah and Daniel, who met at like a summer camp when they were teenagers, but they ended on quite a sour note, and there's always been like this little bit of resentment that or particularly Leah has carried with her over the years. They end up bumping into each other as adults, and actually the way their lives come together in what are ultimately like a lot of very convenient coincidences bring them back together, and they start to kind of rekindle the initial chemistry that they had even as teenagers. I thought that was quite a fun concept, you know, meeting someone that you knew when you were younger, when you are an adult, and seeing how they've changed, how you have changed, whether you can kind of let go of previous feelings of resentment that you've held on to for a long time. I thought the chemistry between the two characters was really good. I found it really interesting how both characters explored their relationships with being like mixed race and Jewish. I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it was a really great point of connection for the two characters. The strings that end up being pulled to bring these two characters back together are like quite coincidental. Do I think they're slightly like unrealistic? Maybe a little bit, but I had fun with it nonetheless. And also one of the things I really enjoyed about this book was the surrounding cast of their friends. Like it ended up feeling like a really good group of mates. And another big prop that I have to give this book is that there is a side character who is Irish that rang really true to me. There was like one tiny thing where I was like, oh, I don't know if that sounds quite right. But I mean, earlier this year, I read a book of like someone who is not Irish writing an Irish character, and it made me want to throw up in my mouth, honestly. So to see this done quite well in this friend character. I was very pleased. So I also read a short story collection. I read The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jen Campbell. So Jen, of course, you may know for this book or many of her other books, but also on her booktube channel. I really love all the content she makes on her booktube channel, and she's one of the booktubers I've been watching for the longest time. I'd only really read her children's picture books and some of her poetry before, and I really enjoyed both of those. And I was really intrigued to read this collection of short stories because it's not necessarily what I would typically pick up thematically, and I have had some success recently reading short stories that are a little bit out of my comfort zone. But having finished this now, I do think that experience was a bit of an outlier. I think typically I don't get on with short story collections, especially I suppose if they are in a genre that isn't necessarily what I'm drawn to. This is a collection of, I suppose, modern fairy tales, but I do think they're like quite literary in a way that just isn't to my tastes. I struggled to grasp the stories in the kind of the fantasy elements, the kind of whimsical elements, the elements of, I suppose, like the uncanny. On a line level, I really enjoyed how like beautifully constructed a lot of the sentences were. This is very much one where I'm like, oh, it's not you, it's me. The classic I read was Where Angels Fear to Tread by E.M. Forster. If you watched my recent like mid-year freak out tag, I did say that E.M. Forster was like my new favorite author for the year. I've read 2 of his books earlier this year and really got on with them, and I guess I'm on like somewhat of a binge now, with this being my 3rd of the year. And what I said in that previous video about E.M. Forster's books was that it's a bit like he's sat down on your couch, he's slammed his hands on the table, and he's been like, right, the maddest thing just happened, I'm gonna tell you all about it. And I honestly feel like I'm just listening to someone spin me a really good yarn when I read his books. Like I find myself being like, and then what happened, and then what happened. This is quite a brief novel, and it is tinged with quite a lot of tragedy, and that is the thing that makes you kind of be like, oh my god. But it's also like a comedy. The blurb describes it as a comedy of manners, and I suppose like, yeah, that's a really like apt description of it. This is about a woman named Lilia who, following the death of her husband, she begins a relationship with a much younger Italian man of a lower social class to her. And this is a major embarrassment for like her in-laws. They all think that this Italian guy is like totally unsuitable, like it's an embarrassment to the family. And as I've seen with previous E.M. Forster books that I've read, we have that analysis and kind of critique of like a really rigid class structure and also like culture clashes. But what I found with this one, which I think was slightly kind of different to the 2 that I've read previously, was some of the, you know, surprising turns of tragedy. So yeah, really enjoyed this one and definitely want to read more of this author's work. Okay, I'm not going to spend too long on this non-fiction book, but I read Alex Ferguson's Autobiography, and actually I listened to this one. I've had this on my shelf for ages. You may know that I'm a massive Manchester United fan. I grew up under the reign of Sir Alex Ferguson, and like many Manchester United fans at the minute, I like to reflect on the good old days. I've watched lots of documentaries about this period of Manchester United's like modern history. Documentaries, you know, from differing perspectives, you know, different players, some more objectives accounts. And I did find that even though this autobiography came out quite a few years ago, there were like some points that I hadn't heard before. Like I've heard a lot of these stories repeated over and over again through various perspectives, but they were all like, they were still colored, or there were still things added in reading this book. But because there was that level of familiarity with a lot of the, you know, anecdotes or insights in this book, it was the perfect like audiobook to have on when I was like doing chores and that kind of thing. I don't know, there's something that just feels, I don't know whether it's nostalgic, comforting to me about like consuming this kind of media. So yeah, I had a good time. I read The Sunbearer Trials by Aidan Thomas. So this is the 3rd Aidan Thomas book that I have read. So the first one I read was The Cemetery Boys, and I really enjoyed that. And then I also read Lost in the Neverwoods, which is like a Peter Pan inspired like retelling. I'm sad to say that I didn't enjoy this book as much as I did Aidan Thomas's other books, and I think that kind of counters how a lot of people might experience his books. So the Sunbearer Trials are like this competition between 10 of the very best semi-diosas, and we are predominantly following Tio, who is the 17-year-old son of the goddess of birds, and he is not worried about being selected to be part of the trials. He thinks it's far more likely that someone else will be selected, but lo and behold, he is selected. And then throughout the competition, he's a bit of an underdog that continuously like proves himself and actually is the guy to keep an eye on. Unless you're the Hunger Games, I don't know if I love the whole group of kids pushed together to be part of a big competition and smashy smash, fighting, magic. What I will say is I do think Aidan Thomas's contribution to that like area of the fantasy genre is quite unique, and I do love how he incorporates elements of, you know, the cultures of his upbringing, but also I love how he seamlessly integrates trans characters into his stories, and he does like highlight the importance of how trans people might experience the world differently, but it's in such like a celebratory, inclusive way. It's a shame that I didn't enjoy this one as much as I kind of thought I would, having enjoyed his previous books. I'm probably gonna unhaul this one, and I do have the sequel on my shelf, which I'll probably do the same thing with, but I'll definitely be keeping Cemetery Boys and Lost in the Neverwoods because I really enjoyed those. I also read Chronicles of Weatherwhy, The Age of Enchantment by Anna James. So Anna James you may know for the Pages & Co series. This is a new series from her, and I really enjoyed it. So in this world of Weatherwhy, everyone has magic inside of them, and I really loved the kind of unique magical system of this one in that it is all based in the seasons. So you have a particular affiliation to either spring, summer, autumn, or winter magic, but there are also people called enchanters who have the ability to wield the magic of all 4 of the seasons. And if you are an enchanter, you were invited to study at Thistledown Academy, and that is what happens to our main character, Juniper. Meanwhile, her twin brother Rafferty follows his sister to Stormgrove, which is where this academy is, to train as a bookbinder. And that's one of the things that I loved about this book that also, you know, was something that I loved about Pages & Co, was the love for books that is within the pages of this book. Like, if you are a bookish person, if you have a bookish kid in your life, they will absolutely love all of the kind of magic around bookbinding. But as Rafferty kind of goes through his journey, he becomes involved with something far more mysterious than he expected. And then we also are following Juniper, learning more about her magic. I think this was a great like introduction to this world that felt really cozy, that I felt really at home in. I was really intrigued to learn more about like where the story was going to go, and I definitely want to read more. And then very quickly on the 2 books that I read for work. So I read Deep Dark by Zora Nabi. So this is a new series from Zora Nabi, all based around Cassia Thorne, who is a bit of an Enola Holmes type figure, solving mysteries on the streets of Victorian London, but with a bit of a kind of supernatural twist to it as well. I think Zora did an amazing job of kind of capturing the atmosphere of Victorian London for a child audience. And a lot of the setting of this book are bits of London that I know really well, so that was a lot of fun to read about as well. And then I also read Robin Hood, aged 10 3/4 by Ben Miller. So this is about Charlie, who is often quite lonely at school and finds herself disappearing into the world of books, but also the sanctuary of her school library. But one day she travels through a mysterious magical bookcase in the library and finds herself somewhere very different. She finds herself in a world of outlaws and knights and queens, and she is welcomed as a hero, but she doesn't feel like one. And over the course of the book, she comes to realize her own bravery, her own heroism, the friendship that surrounds her. And as with all of Ben's books, this is just kind of like a real cozy fairy tale story that you will absolutely just like fly through. So that is it. They are all of the books that I read in July. I have a really good feeling about August. Like, I don't want to speak too soon, I don't want to jinx it, but I feel like August is going to be really good. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. If you want to let me know you are here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me some sort of like space emoji, whether that's like a moon or a rocket or a star, anything like that, in honor of the Kiss Countdown. That's all I'm going to chat to you about today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.